Herzlich willkommen zu 99 zu 1. Welcome to 99 zu 1. My name is Nadim and we are today producing our fourth episode on Hezbollah, on this book, together with our infamous Aurélie. Welcome, Aurélie. Welcome back.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
Hi, nice to have you here again. Today we are going to talk about the next topic that we wanted to address, which is basically Hezbollah and Lebanese politics. How does Hezbollah relate to Lebanese politics, and how to understand what's going on there, because it is kind of a particular dynamic, and it's important to talk about those details. But before we do that, I need to, as always, do an introduction of our guest and butcher the French names. So let's talk a little bit about who we are talking to. Aurélie Daher is French, English, and Arabic-speaking academic who teaches political science and the sociology of conflict at University of Paris-Dauphine, Institut Pratique du Journalisme, and Sciences Po Paris. She holds a master's degree in public management from ESCP Europe, as well as a master's degree in political science and DEA, not DEA, but DEA, in sociology of the Muslim world, and a PhD in political science from Sciences Po Paris. Her research focuses on Hezbollah, obviously, on Middle Eastern Shiaism, Lebanese and Middle Eastern politics. That's also why this episode is going to be particularly interesting. She also works on new aspects of Middle Eastern jihadism and its repercussions on European societies. The first 3 episodes of the series are already out. The first one was about the question what Hezbollah is and isn't, especially related to certain stereotypes that are pretty dominant in, let's say, Western discourse on Hezbollah. And the second 2 episodes dealt with the reasons for Hezbollah's popularity in Lebanon. And as I said, today it's about Hezbollah and Lebanese politics. Hezbollah is often depicted as a state in the state, or a non-state state actor, or proto-state, some kind of alternative rule. Germany recently likes to depict it as Hezbollah kind of holding Lebanon and Lebanese government hostage with their military force. So it's important to disentangle a little bit what that is. Maybe let's talk first about Hezbollah and how it sees the state. Does it even have a philosophy of the state? Does it have a special understanding of what political power should be? Does it have a political model that it aspires to, or something like that?
Yes, that's an excellent question. They do have a philosophy of the state, or at least on paper. They do on paper. In real life, it's a little bit different. They're way more into the adjustment and the adaptation mode. Let's put it this way. They can adapt to the context rather easily. But on paper, Hezbollah's leadership considers that the best political regime, or the ideal political regime, is the Islamic one. Okay? All the same, we have to be very careful, because what they mean by that is not very clear. They don't give so many details. We have to keep in mind that the same individuals in the leadership who said that they had a great admiration for the Islamic model, or for an Islamic model for the state, they're exactly the same people who always, in the same time, like to clarify one point, which is they acknowledge there's always a but. We want an Islamic state, or we think the Islamic state is the best system, but okay, there's a but. And the but is that the Lebanese socio-demographic reality make this model impossible to implement in Lebanon. So it's an ideal, not a project. Fact is, again, facts speak louder than words. Fact is that they have always accepted in practice to play by the rules of the consociational system. The consociational system being the Lebanese political system that we have been having since 1920, date of the creation of Lebanon. Now, some people said, yeah, but this is hypocrisy. You know, they say they like it, they're not going to do it, but maybe they're waiting for some other time to do that. Maybe they're going to do it, you know, behind our backs or someday by surprise. When it comes to possible hidden intentions of establishing an Islamic State in Lebanon, because they were accused a few times of hypocrisy. I would say three things when it comes to possible hidden intentions. Three things. First thing, it's an anecdote, but it's a very telling one. Former Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah was roasted, I remember, a few years ago by some media in Lebanon, because at some point somebody found a video clip of him that went viral. The video clip went back to 1982. Hassan Nasrallah was born in 1960, so he was, 21, 22. And he was talking about in this video about his support to the idea of an Islamic State in Lebanon. And interestingly enough, in that interview where he was roasted years later, Hassan Nasrallah's answer was quite surprising and, as I said, quite telling. He said, I spoke rubbish. I was 22 years old. And then he laughed and he said, who never said anything foolish when they were in their early 20s? And you know what? That was the end of it. Now, obviously, you're going to say that's an anecdote. Is it really a fact? Okay. So I'm going to give you maybe a bit more substantial fact, okay? The same Hassan Nasrallah, at some point, and more seriously and with more detail, he explained that Hezbollah did have, yes, a special thing for the Islamic model. But he said that the state, if it were to happen, if it were to be implemented in Lebanon, it should be implemented after being chosen democratically by the Lebanese society itself. He didn't talk about the Shia, he said the Lebanese society in its entirety itself. And his commitment to democracy was not fake, because he actually defended it not from the political science point of view, but from a religious point of view. Because he said, in Islam, there's a principle that says, La ikraha fi din, which means in English, there should be no coercion in religion. You cannot impose anything on anyone in the name of religion. Okay? So if you want to go with an Islamic state and you want to force it on a population, that state cannot be Islamic, because its religious legitimacy won't be valid. And obviously, if Hezbollah were in a hypothetical situation to try to push forward an Islamic state, obviously they want that state to be legitimate under God's law. And then Hassan Nasrallah added that he meant that when he said that state should be democratically chosen by the Lebanese, he said, I am expecting that day to have a referendum where the results of the referendum in favor of the Islamic State should not be of 51%. He said, I want a referendum of at least 90%. He said, I will go in practice for an Islamic State in Lebanon the day 90% at least of the Lebanese ask for it. So if you basically understand what he's really saying, he is putting a kind of a very improbable condition to the achievement of a project he says he supports. Okay, so this is why I say on paper, but not in reality. Now, if you add to that, to everything I said, the fact that other officials within Hezbollah also mentioned another condition for a possible Islamic state to see the light in Lebanon. Okay, they added an extra condition to that. They said, we potentially will have an Islamic state in Lebanon, but not before the whole Middle East, all the countries of the Middle East have their own Islamic state before Lebanon. It will make sense to have an Islamic state in Lebanon when all the countries of the Middle East will have their own. So again, they're adding like extra conditions in order for that potential project to be valid or to come to light. And won't basically understand that those conditions either are impossible to achieve or won't see the light before, I don't know, like hundreds of years. So at the end of the day, that talk about Hezbollah and the Islamic State, that was a little bit a thing in the 80s and the 90s, and eventually everybody dropped it. Even Hezbollah's fierce adversaries in Lebanese politics, nobody talks about Hezbollah wanting to establish an Islamic State anymore. Like, Hezbollah is criticized but for so many things, but definitely not for that. It's an old topic, and you know, I think that at the end of the day, in more than 40 years in existence and more than 20 years in political business, Hezbollah showed that, you know, their priority was definitely not a regime change in Lebanon.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense, and we already talked a little bit about this too. But then maybe let's go to the fact that basically they constitute something like. We talked about them constituting something like a rule on certain areas, which are basically Shia areas, for example, in the south of Lebanon. So let's say, okay, not on all of Lebanon, but maybe in those areas that they are in control, like that maybe they want to install their, you know, tiny Islamic states or mini states throughout Lebanon there. How about that?
Yeah, it's a good question because. Like, I remember, like, some French diplomats at some point, like, asked me, said, okay, maybe Hezbollah is not capable of establishing an Islamic State in Lebanon right now, maybe not in 20 years, but maybe they are trying to do so, or they might do so easier in their own areas, you know, meaning in the south, in the northeast of Lebanon, or in Dahi, in the southern suburbs of Beirut, like a little crypto Islamic State. Well, the problem is this, is that the Shia themselves, okay, they're not interested in Islamic State, okay? Now, some of them might appreciate maybe a more conservative type of society, okay? A little bit more religion on Friday, women may be wearing scarves. Not even, those are really a minority, tiny minority. But all the same, you know, rising the level of spirituality in a society is one thing. Establishing an Islamic State, that's a totally different thing. And guess what? Talking about like an Islamic State and the Shia potentially being interested in, for instance, the Iranian model, okay? Because obviously lots of Shia support Iran, look up at Iran, like, wow, Iran, like that's a true state, what a great achievement, etc. And by the way, when the Shia talk about Iran and Khomeini, and what they see in Iran and Khomeini is completely different from what a Western could see in Iran and Khomeini. You know, so when some Shia praise Iran and Khomeini, they don't praise the institutional system. We have to be very careful at what is it exactly that they like, that they put forward. They praise the fact that Iran, well, first of all, is a big country with great natural resources, not the case of Lebanon. They like the fact that it's a powerful country in the region, that it is sovereign, you know, contrary to Lebanon, that keeps, you know, being balloted by all sorts of regional powers, international powers, intervening directly in its domestic policy. They like the fact that Iran is capable of standing up to its adversaries, that potentially Iran could maybe have the capacity of, you know, self-sufficiency economically, which is absolutely not the case of Lebanon. Eventually, they like in Iran everything they would wish for Lebanon. That's the thing that you don't have, that they don't have in Lebanon. Plus, by the way, they also, because usually, you know, the Lebanese are people who have a certain knowledge, certain culture of other countries. They also, they're very admirative of the weight of the history, the culture, the Iranian culture, that whole, you know, Persian thing, etc. So, and I think eventually what they also like in Iran is the fact that they see Iran as something that is genuine in its Oriental identity, like proud to be Oriental and feared by its non-Oriental enemies. And again, that's what they wish for Lebanon, or at least that's something they don't have in Lebanon. At least, for instance, not as far as being proud to be Oriental goes, because as you know, in Lebanon, we have, you know, a society that is sometimes that is torn between its belonging to the Middle East, to its Arab identity, to its Arab history, etc., being part of the Levant. And then we have also other identities in Lebanon that see themselves like more westernized, more attached to an outside world, or to the Mediterranean world, for instance, way more than the truly Oriental world. So that we have a kind of the East and the West are a little bit in competition in Lebanon, or at least both are there in Lebanon. And some Shia are like, well, at least in Iran, like they're proud to be Oriental, and they managed to do something actually great from that Oriental identity. It's not something they're ashamed of. It's not something that is handicapping or anything. So that's what they like in Iran. But they definitely, it's not about like establishing an Islamic rule in their own, in the Hezbollah areas. And by the way, in the 80s, I remember, because, well, I grew up in Baalbek in the early 80s. At some point, you had some zealots among Hezbollah who were, trying to kind of, push a little bit of social conservatism on some people. It always backfired. People are like, just go fight Israel. You have our support when it comes to the military, freeing the country from Israeli occupation, but let us live our lives the way we want. Don't interfere in that. So eventually, Hezbollah dropped any idea of, imposing any Islamic kind of ruling or even kind of Islamic social control over their population. It's all like if people do it, it's because, obviously they're into it. They like it, but it's not because Hezbollah basically is forcing you to be part of it.
Okay, that kind of already answers part of my next question, but it would be basically going towards the idea of, okay, maybe they don't want to impose something, but could they not slowly start working towards an Islamic state by their voting and their activities in parliament, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. Or completely from the other side, not taking this in the first place, this democratic idea, but really going for some kind of coup, right? Coup d'etat, maybe take over with their military force, or maybe take over from the inside, in the sense of taking over the parliament from the inside, by getting voted into the parliament, etc. So, okay. How do you think about that?
So the idea of, basically, your question is the idea of an Islamic state that would be a top-down project rather than a bottom-up. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Not toppling the state, but actually like using the state, the means of the state that is already there in order to bring it.
Like having a
life.
law, like provoking a regime change through the parliament. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So a coup d'etat, because you mentioned the notion of coup d'etat. Okay. So a coup d'etat in the classical sense of the word, I mean a violent initiative of the revolutionary kind, that would make that Islamic state freshly put in place completely illegitimate. Because as I said, remember, la ikraha fi din, okay, that would kill the legitimacy of that Islamic state on the spot. No coercion in religion, so coup d'etat, drop it. Now, when it comes to forcing an Islamic state on the Lebanese itself through a vote in parliament, guess what? It's not going to be possible either, but for a different reason. Hezbollah in parliament, FYI, Hezbollah in parliament never had, and cannot have actually more than 10 to 12 MPs. We never had more than 10 to 12 Hezbollah MPs in parliament out of 128 seats. So 10 to 12 out of 128 seats total. That's less than 10%. That's Hezbollah's presence in the parliament. Always been. No more than that. Their presence is rather constant. That's basically their average number. Whatever the legislative elections, that's basically what they get, okay? A little bit less than 10%. So if Hezbollah were to plan a law changing the system, they would need the votes of quite a lot of other political forces in the country. And as you can imagine, the question is, who in Lebanon, other than Hezbollah, would like to see an Islamic state in Lebanon? And guess what? No one. Obviously, no one. And by the way, all the same, I remember eventually, I did a field work a few years ago, interviews, actually lots of them, with high-ranked officials, but also with clerics. affiliated to Hezbollah, and about that notion of the Islamic State, etc. And at the end of the day, I kept asking, like, how do you visualize concretely that ideal Islamic State in action? Like, in terms of what kind of institutions, etc. They didn't have a clue about what kind of institution, like how technically it would work at the institutional level. But two things kept coming in the interviews, popping up again and again and again, always, whatever the person I would interview. And it's not something like they discussed together. So it's really something that was really shared, genuinely shared. The first thing that pops up is a wish that is very clear, a wish for a strong state capable of defending its people and its territory against foreign invaders. That's the first thing that would keep coming up in the discussions. And second, a state that is a just state. What they mean by just state, it's a state that supports its poorest and most needy citizens. Now, you think about it, and if you keep in mind that obviously all the Hezbollah officials, when they dream about the perfect state, this is what they dream about: protection, security, especially against foreign invaders. Second, like a real solidarity programs, for people in socioeconomic complicated situations. What you immediately understand is that when they reason about the state, they're not reasoning as Hezbollah people. They're just reasoning as average Shia. Because at the end of the day, what are the two main problems of the Shia in Lebanon? Exactly that. We need somebody to protect us from the Israelis who keep invading, burning, bombarding, etc. us. And obviously the international community is not there to protect us. The Lebanese Army is incapable of doing so. And second, we are in the poorest areas for very long time. Obviously, we were kind of underdeveloped economically and socially, and we want a state that does their job in this regard. So they reason way more like Lebanese than like Islamists when they talk about politics.
Okay, I want to go back to the first point you made, because this is very important to be understood, because you said they never had more than 10%, but you also mentioned that they cannot represent more than 10%. Whereas, like, why not? If people, vote for them, then they could have more seats, right? So why did you say that? Why can they not represent more than 10%?
Okay, so I'm going to need to open a parenthesis. Don't worry, I'm not going to give a whole lecture on political science and associational systems, but all the same, I need to take just a few minutes to explain a little bit how the Lebanese political system works very briefly, because otherwise it's going to be impossible to understand how Hezbollah navigates in the Lebanese institutions and the political system, okay? So the Lebanese system officially is called confessionalism, okay? And confessionalism, if you want, is a subcategory, a sub-brand of larger category of political systems called consociational systems, okay? Now, a very, very long story, very short. A consociational system is usually opposed to what we call one-man, one-vote systems. One-man, one-vote system is easy to understand. Basically, you have elections. Every citizen in age to vote, or allowed, obviously, to vote, are going to, cast a vote in a box. At the end of the day, we open the boxes, we count the votes. The candidate who gets the larger number of votes is the winner. D'accord? I'm caricaturing a bit, but you got my point. Now, in consociational system, things are a little bit different. You do have same thing, elections, etc., and same thing. We count the votes. However, the result might be distorted by extra rules and regulations. Basically, power in consociational systems are distributed over the players through the same system of majority-based votes, but they're twisted to some point by quotas. Quotas of power distribution per community. And that sometimes can bring, for instance, a candidate, Mr. X, to the parliament at the expense of candidate Mr. Y, while a number of votes candidate Mr. Y got more than those of Mr. X, of candidate Mr. X. So in Lebanon, for instance, in order to visualize a little bit more what I'm describing theoretically. In Lebanon, for instance, whatever the results of legislative elections, the 128 seats in parliament will need to be shared equally between Christians, whatever kind of Christian, and Muslims, whatever kind of Muslims. 64 seats for the Christians, 64 seats for the Muslims. Now, among the Christian seats, other quotas, obviously, tell us how many for the Maronites, how many for the Armenians, how many for the Greek Orthodox, how many for the Catholics. Turns out that the Maronites, who represent the largest Christian community in Lebanon, they have 34 seats out of 64. Okay, 34 for the Maronites. So they are basically the power engine of the Christian House in Parliament. Now, in the Muslim House, okay, Sunnis and Shia have the same number of seats, which is 27. It's 27 seats each. 27 for the Sunnis, 27 for the Shia. Okay, so you add also another feature of that Lebanese consociational system, confessionist system. You add the fact that, for instance, the president in Lebanon, because Lebanon is a republic, it's not a monarchy, the president in Lebanon should always be a Maronite, Christian Maronite. The prime minister is always a Sunni. The head of chamber of parliament is always a Shia. Vice prime minister should be a Greek Orthodox, the head of the army a Maronite, And like that, like in most institutions, you have like a rule or two regarding which community has the upper hand on this or that. Now, back to Hezbollah. Hezbollah in the system, obviously, is a Shia player, okay? So Hezbollah cannot go beyond a certain level of presence in those state institutions because of those rules. Now, they need to share, and according either to very strict or very explicit rules that are in the constitutions, they get a share, or according to quotas and proportions, they can negotiate with the other political players and communities. Now, the Shia, as I said, they have 27 seats in parliament, okay? 27. That's the share of the Shia. The problem is Hezbollah is not the only Shia player. They have a competitor, okay? There's Amal. Amal is the second big Shia party, and Amal has never been in the mood to be, let's put it this way, more generous than necessary with the Hezbollah contender. So they're fierce competitors, and they definitely want their share of the cake. So at the end of the day, 27 seats to share between Hezbollah and Amal, they basically, Hezbollah could never get more than 10 to 12 seats.
How are these numbers, like how are these defined? Are they defined, I mean, obviously in the law, I guess, but where do they come from? Is this like based on some census, or do they get renewed at some point, or are they fixed, or like?
So those numbers were changed after the Civil War. They were a bit different when Lebanon was created. Lebanon was created in 1920, okay, by the French. And they immediately, like the French, decided to go with a consociational system for the Lebanese. It was a way to reassure the Christians that at the end of the day, whatever the number of Muslims in the population, the share of power of the Christians would be kind of assured, guaranteed. Now, when Lebanon was created, the proportion of Christians versus Muslims was roughly 55-45, according to a French census of 22, and then a second one in 32. The problem is very quickly in terms of fertility rate, in terms of whether that other community, it depends on the moment where each community achieved their what we call, demographic transition in terms of like number of kids, etc. And then obviously the socioeconomic status of each community impacted also on the number of the children. Then you had wars and crises where every time we had a new wave of immigrants, people leaving the country over the years, and turns out that, as you can imagine, the people who leave first are the people who are the most educated and who have the financial means to leave. So that means most of the time the Christians way before the Muslims, and Sunnis way before Shia. So at the end of the day, we had kind of two social trends that reinforced that Muslim and in particular Shia presence in the society. The Muslims, and especially the Shia, had a higher fertility rate for quite some time. That's not the case anymore. But for quite some time, they were having 6, 8, 10 children, when the Christians would have 3, the Sunnis would have 3, 4, and plus crisis, the Christians leaving, the Muslims staying. So at the end of the day, very quickly, the proportion of the Muslims, grew in the society. That brought in the 60s, 70s, some serious claims, political claims by political Sunni parties asking to renegotiate the quotas, in parliament, etc. Plus, according to that former system, so the Maronites, the Christians, had the upper hand on the parliament, but they also had the upper hand on the executive power, because the president was basically the more powerful man of the political system. It was a president with very strong prerogatives. And that eventually was the main reason for the civil war that we had between 75 and 90. It was first and foremost about, that renegotiating of the distribution of power. The Maronites, obviously, or at least the conservative Maronites, not all of them, part of the Maronites were perfectly okay to renegotiate. They understood why it was legitimate and relevant. But obviously, the guys who had the upper hand on the political system were not happy to let go of a share of their power. So that led to a civil war, obviously for also other reasons. And when international powers, it's external powers, external countries. It's not the Lebanese who put an end to the civil war. Actually, the solution or the end of the civil war was imposed from outside over the Lebanese. Basically, the way that international community, mainly France, the US, but also at that time there was Algeria, Morocco, and Saudi Arabia. It was a kind of quintet working on the Lebanese case. Everybody was in agreement that at the end of the day, the Maronite thing or the fact that the Maronites had quite a lot of weight and power in the Lebanese institutions was obviously too problematic. We needed to tone it down. So they changed the quotas, and then they decided, for instance, at that time, in parliament, we had 6 seats for the Christians versus 5 seats for the Muslims. So then after the war, we decided to go equally, 50-50. And, we kind of revised a few things. The president was stripped from its major prerogatives. Okay. And now, obviously, president in Lebanon is way more about representation than having like a real say in Lebanese politics. They do still have a bit of room for maneuver, but definitely not as it was before the war. And now the main executive power is in the hand of the Lebanese government, the council, what we call the council. And obviously, the council being headed by the prime minister being a Sunni. Technically, after the war, the number one community at the political level became the Sunni rather than the Maronite one. So, and this is basically where that whole thing comes from. The problem is that in 1990, when we changed those quotas, the new formula was already outdated, because even when we decided to go with 50-50, in 1990, the Lebanese population was no longer in a 50-50 kind of rapport de force. The Muslims were more than 50%. But eventually we had a kind of a collective deal within the Lebanese society and among political forces. We said, we're going to go with an imperfect system rather than go back to a civil war. So, and Hezbollah is, they said in 1990, we're going to accept it as a temporary solution, but eventually we know what temporary means in the Middle East. Sometimes temporary can last for 100, 150 years. As long as they manage to get what they want, they don't really care about the weight of their representation in the political system when it comes to Hezbollah.
Okay. I mean, so far regarding the question of Hezbollah imposing their will and their vision of a state, maybe even an Islamic state on Lebanese society through the parliament. What about the government? You said the council, because I think these quotas don't exist there. How about that?
Okay, that's true enough. No quotas within the government. Okay, no quotas, but all the same, the constitution says that the government a decision made by the government cannot be valid and legitimate if it is not taken consensually by all the communities. Let's put it this way. It's not to explain like that in so many words, but that's the idea. Is if the idea is a decision made by the government on which a community would be in a complete disagreement is not valid. So we need to have a consensus, a community-based consensus over the decisions of the government. So at the end of the day, the number of ministries, the number of ministers of members of the government for each community is not what is really at stake. If you want to have a valid decision, what you need is the main communities to be represented in the government, but it doesn't matter how many portfolios for each. What is way more at stake, way more interesting for people interested in being part of the government, in becoming ministers, is the access to state resources. Because obviously when you head a department, I'm thinking, for instance, the public works, for instance, department, with public, markets, reconstruction, stuff like that, etc. You can make a lot of money. You can build clienteles, and you can obviously put a little bit of money on the side on each reconstruction project. So it's a juicy kind of portfolio. Telecommunications at some point was something big. The obviously finances, the economy are obviously big portfolios. And then you have portfolios nobody cares about, that they don't have budget. They're absolutely irrelevant for Lebanese politics. So Hezbollah tried to join the government several times. Problem is this. So quick reminder, Hezbollah joined the national political system for the first time in 1992. Okay, when they decided to join the first post-war legislative elections. Because of the war, the last time we had elections was 1972. So for 20 years, we didn't have any legislative elections. And obviously in 1972, Hezbollah was nowhere to be found. Okay, there was no such thing as Hezbollah. So when people say, "Oh, Hezbollah initially, when they were a green organization, they boycotted elections, etc." No, it never happened in their lives, because there were no election actually whatsoever before 1992. Hezbollah was 10 years old. So in 1992, Hezbollah decided to participate in the institutional life and send MPs, or at least try to send MPs to the parliament. And they also wanted to be part of the first post-war government, except for the fact that after the civil war, we had 15 years of Syrian tutelage over Lebanon. So Lebanon was not a sovereign state after the civil war for 15 years. Damascus was managing the domestic affairs of Lebanon. So and Syria actually prevented Hezbollah from being in the government. Syria didn't want actually Hezbollah to be part of the government. So it was there. I mean, Hezbollah was present in parliament, but couldn't have their first minister until 2005. So that's quite rather recent. So 20 years in government, and then 30 years, more than 30 years in parliament. The series, basically, the problem with the series is the series didn't want Hezbollah to become too big. Okay, they started to notice that Hezbollah was going to become popular because of that resistant thing, etc. Plus, Amal, okay, that second Shia political party, was the true protege of Damascus, way more than Hezbollah. Hezbollah was more the Iranian protege. So obviously the Syrians also wanted, they didn't want to jeopardize the interests of their Shia protege in the Lebanese state institution. So they wanted Hezbollah, to stay small. And so Hezbollah had to be patient. They waited to 2005. as I said, 2005, they eventually managed to go to the government. But what is funny here is that since 2005, we had governments in Lebanon that counted from 24 to 30 members each time. Yes, I know, it's a lot. For a country that is 1/3 of Belgium, having 24 to 30 ministers, that's quite a lot. But all the same, now, among those 24 to 30 ministers or members of the government, Hezbollah never, ever, ever had more than 2 ministers. Yes, two. Like in 1 + 1 = 2. And that's it. Plus, not only that, they had only 2 out of 24 or 30 departments, but they usually get the ones that the other parties do not want. They get the leftovers. I hope Hezbollah is not watching this. And they have either irrelevant portfolios, like completely like totally meaningless portfolios, or they have real portfolios, or I mean decent portfolios, but like with small impact or such a small budget that the guys cannot do anything relevant. I'm going to give you a few examples just to make you smile. So, for instance, Hezbollah, in almost 20 years in the government now, was at some point in charge of the Ministry of Industry. And the industry in Lebanon is an almost inexistent sector. Okay, and then
yes, we all know them, the Lebanese cars.
I mean, the Mercedes-Benz is a plastic toy in comparison with the Lebanese cars, right?
Yes.
So they also had hilarious, that one, the Ministry of Sports and Youth, and they give it to a guy who was already in his 60s and not really the sporting guy. But anyway, his heart is in the right place. His heart is in the right place, but all the same, like, dude, Hezbollah, okay, sports and youth. They had the Ministry of Administrative Reform. This one is hilarious. Like the one nobody cares about, like nobody intends to have anything achieved through that department. At some point, a little bit more seriously, they got the Ministry of Health. So health is an important ministry. The problem is it's completely broke. Not a dime there. They were also at some point in charge with the agriculture. It's a small ministry, but for Shia, it's relevant for the Shia areas because they're very agricultural areas. So giving the agriculture to Hezbollah kind of made sense. And eventually, I think the most hilarious one, the one I really liked, it was at some point they got the Ministry of Energy and Water, and that's a huge thing. The problem is that the Hezbollah minister, I really hope again he's not watching this, the Hezbollah minister who was in charge of the dossier discovered through his work that it was because he was put in charge of restructuring the whole company called Électricité du Liban. Okay, that's the big electricity company in Lebanon. And he was asked to basically kind of dismantle it and rebuild it because it was it was so complicated and completely dysfunctional. The problem is the guy realized that it was so mafia-ridden, all sorts of mafia, that he begged the Hezbollah leadership to get him out of there. And at the end of the mandate of the government, he gave interviews and said, never again. And actually, you know what? Indeed, Hezbollah never, ever took that ministry again. They never asked for the electricity department ever again.
Yeah, electricity is a thing in Lebanon. The kahraba.
It's kahraba.
Yeah, exactly. I remember as a kid always being responsible for putting the candles in the living room, in the guest room, etc. when the electricity cuts, which happens every day.
Yeah, or turning on the private.
And now there are generators, and that's what the mafia is then about. You know, the business about the generators, the gasoline, and all the stuff. Yeah.
Even Hezbollah is afraid of that.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Yeah, that must be serious. So, okay, but then it sounds like, okay, they don't really have a lot of leverage, a lot of maneuvering power in like both state institutions, parliament and government. And then the question rises, I mean, also knowing where Hezbollah comes from, being a resistance organization, why even join Lebanese politics in the first place? Why even, become basically a political party to be voted for?
Okay, they do have leverage, but they do it differently. They have leverage because they have allies and friends. Right? That's basically their true power in the system. But when it comes to why join the state institutions for Hezbollah, okay, let's put it this way: Hezbollah sees the Lebanese institutions as both a potential threat, or at least a potential source of problem, and a complementary positive system. So the state could be, for them, it's like capable of the best and the worst. So the Lebanese state can be a threat if the government, for instance, were to take, a decision to jeopardize the interests of the Islamic resistance. So the Islamic resistance, the military part of the organization. If for instance, the government would come with law projects that the parliament might have considered, and maybe some of those laws are going to be, jeopardizing the interests of the IRL. Because we have to remember that there's a distribution of tasks, okay? There's a distribution of roles between Hezbollah and the IRL, the civil part and the military part of the organization. And we need to keep in mind that Hezbollah was created by the IRL, okay? The IRL, the military, is the matrix. That's the mother organization, let's put it this way. It's the heart of the organization. And Hezbollah was created both to mobilize the community and the society around the resistance cause, and to be a buffer, between the IRL and the same society and the state. And that's something we explained plenty in the previous episode. But the state for Hezbollah is also a complementary system to Hezbollah's institutions, in the sense that, for instance, the parliament for them can be used as a platform to advocate publicly, for in favor of the resistance cause. And what is even more important is that through the parliament, Hezbollah can, as I said, build alliances with other parties, something they couldn't if they would stay outside the system. Now, being part of the system, they can build alliances with other parties, because other parties may also find interests in creating coalitions with Hezbollah. And through the government, obviously, the Hezbollah and its friends can then defend the interests of the IRL in Lebanon and outside of Lebanon. Because for Hezbollah, the Lebanese state can also, not always, but at some times, depends on the period of history, could also be used as an external platform to act as a buffer against, this time, external capacités de nuisance against Hezbollah. And that's basically the idea, is to use the diplomatic channels of the Lebanese state, okay, to defend the Hezbollah from the outside. So at the end of the day, if you think of it, they're not really interested in politics itself, okay? They function way more like a lobby than a regular party, okay? And that's also paradoxically the fact that they're just a lobby, that they're just interested in one thing. The idea is, don't touch the resistance. Apart from that, do whatever you want. And that makes them quite bearable in the state system for other political parties. Because, first of all, while all political parties in Lebanon run for elections, join the institutional apparatus in order to have access to distributable resources. We talked about patronage clientelism in a previous episode. So those resources, okay, that are within the state, they're being grabbed by the communities through the different portfolios within the government, through also special envelopes in the parliament, and they are redistributed on the constituencies, the communities. Again, that's the typical, according to the typical traditional patron-client tradition in Lebanese politics. Now, obviously, while those parties are competing during elections, and once they are in the system, they still fight with each other to have access to state resources. It's like endless negotiations between the communities and the parties. Who's going to get that chair? And if you get that chair this time, then next year I want that same share. No. It's endless negotiation. Hezbollah gladly leaves the benefit of all those material gains from being in politics to the other parties. It's like, take my share. I don't care. Hezbollah did that. I remember in 2013, we were talking about having a new government, etc. And at some point, the Sunnis were very pissed at Hezbollah for X reasons, etc. Saudi Arabia obviously was pushing in the back. And eventually, Hezbollah said, you know what? Usually we have, two ministers in the government. This time we're going to have one, and our share we're going to give it to the Sunnis. They just let go of their share, like more quite gladly. They don't care. Why? Because Hezbollah, also, as we explained in a former episode, they don't need that state money. They have their own money, so they're not greedy when it comes to state money, and that in the end makes him, as I said, rather welcome in the Lebanese state institutions by the other parties, because they don't feel threatened by Hezbollah when it comes to sharing the state money cake. Okay, and that's also why, for instance, I was talking about Hezbollah getting the leftovers when it comes to the governmental portfolios. That's also why the Hezbollah ministers, they don't have any problem being assigned to less interesting or sometimes the least sexy portfolios, departments, and ministry. They gladly leave, for instance, as I said, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Economy, Public Works, all the juicy ministries who benefit obviously from big envelopes. Hezbollah is glad to leave it to the other parties. The rule, if you want to get on well with Hezbollah in politics, is very easy. On Hezbollah's side, the deal is this: as long as the other parties commit to not harm the IRL, okay, not put the IRL in an uncomfortable situation, not jeopardize its interest, as long as the other parties are not a threat to the resistance, then the other parties can do whatever they like. Hezbollah will never go after them, will never block their plans. I remember there was I think it was in the late 90s, a few years after the end of the war, I think it was the Kata'ib who pushed forward that law. Anyway, major Christian party. Okay, they wanted to have a law passed in parliament that would allow some areas of Lebanon, obviously the Christian areas of Lebanon, especially the ones around Beirut, to be able to open more pubs, nightclubs, cafes, restaurants, etc. They wanted to, take advantage of the revival of tourism after the war, and try to help their areas, have a sort of a new socioeconomic bloom after the war. So the idea was more cafes, more pubs, more restaurants, more nightclubs. And the Sunnis were not super in favor of, like, they said, okay, but at the same time, this is probably going to kind of encourage indecent and improper behaviors by young people. They're going to get drunk, they're going to have sex, we're going to have drugs. So we need to keep it, in reasonable limits, within reasonable limits, etc. And Hezbollah was like, do whatever you want, we don't care. You want to open as many pubs, you want to all get drunk, you want to smoke cocaine on the street, we don't care. As long as in return you don't vote in favor of anything that jeopardizes the resistance. That's the deal. So that, I think, also explains why in 2019, remember when we have those major popular demonstrations on the streets against, the establishment, etc., against the political staff. That's why I think the reproaches that were formulated by a lot of the demonstrators against Hezbollah were a little bit different from those targeting the other parties, because at the end of the day, they couldn't accuse Hezbollah of what the other parties did, which was to steal the state, basically empty the treasury, the state treasury, because Hezbollah never did that. They never did that because they never needed the money. But at the end of the day, Hezbollah was still accused of being guilty by association, because the idea was, yes, okay, you didn't steal, but you let them steal. You didn't say anything. You covered it for the sake of the resistance. So that's how basically the reproach was a little bit different.
So this kullan was also geared towards Hezbollah, but not like they would not argue for that in the sense of that Hezbollah is, corrupt themselves and getting all the money for themselves, but rather that they would just abide with the others doing that. Interesting. I didn't know that. Very good. Okay, but there is still like the one thing that also gets German guys off a lot these days, which is basically the question on the Hezbollah as a military organization, or the IRL, which is ultimately they are a military that is not associated with the state. Lebanon does have its own military, which is kind of puny in relation to the capacities of Hezbollah, and they are basically autonomous with this military. So what everybody that has like a normal, democratic idea about a state is it should be the monopoly of power, especially of violence, and that clearly is separated out there. So isn't then the Lebanese state, their institutions, all the people that are taking part in this, aren't they then actually doing something that is illegal in the sense of aiding and abetting a different military power?
Yeah. Yes. First, a little note. That idea of one state should have just one army, and that army should be under the authority. That's quite the Max Weber's syndrome. Yes. What I call the Max Weber syndrome. When he said basically that the state is the political actor that has the monopoly of political legitimate violence. And as I teach my students when we talk about consociational systems, I said it's so unfortunate that Max Weber never came to Lebanon. He would probably have changed a little bit the definition of what a state is. And by the way, we have in this world. Let's forget a little bit about Lebanon and our Western democracies. We have very weird situations when it comes to actually organizing one's military and the relationship between the military in charge with defending the national territory and the state. We have so many different configurations in the world, way more than we tend to imagine in the West. And I'm thinking, for instance, about Iran. Iran, they have 3 different armies, and they're totally okay with that. So the thing that in consociational systems, several points here actually, because in your question is an amazing one, but in the same time I'm going to need to chop it into maybe 3. Let's put it this way, 3 different points. So first of all, we need to keep in mind that again, consociational systems. In consociational systems, armies by definition are traditionally weak. I would say it comes with the system. Why? Several reasons to that. At the end of the day, the communities of consociational countries, first of all, tend to defend, or might tend to defend the enemy. I'm talking the external enemy differently. So it's difficult to have all the components of an army in their community-based diversity act as one integrated institution fighting the same fight with the same motivation. I'm going to take the case of Lebanon. When Syria entered Lebanon in 1976, the official invitation of the Lebanese president, Slimane Frangieh, back in the time, to save the conservative Maronites who were getting bloody noses by the transconfessional progressist camp, and they were that close to be defeated. Obviously, the army was a little bit torn up between different understanding of what that intervention by the Syrians really meant. Some of them were like, they're here to save us. Others like, no, they're here to invade us. Same thing with the Israelis. The Israelis in 78, especially the Israelis in 82. Obviously, the Maronites were happy. They actually knew they were coming. There was that special deal between the militia of the Lebanese forces. I'm talking, by the way, Lebanese forces. No, I'm not. When I say Lebanese forces, I'm not talking the regular Lebanese army. I'm talking the militia named Lebanese forces. So it's big cap L, big cap F, conservative Maronitism. Basically, they had a deal with the Israelis. You come, you invade, you help us get rid of the Palestinians, you make Bashir president. So they were not invading in the eyes of a part of the population, and obviously in the eyes of officers in the Lebanese army who were on the side of the Lebanese forces. And for other officers, that was an invasion and an annexation. So we have that first problem. Okay, but more importantly, the communities in consociational systems, and that's not just a Lebanese thing, the communities usually are never sure that an army, that hypothetical army that would be the only force to defend the territory put under the authority of the defense ministry, for instance, we cannot be sure that that army will never be used by the community to which the Minister of Defense belongs against other communities. What can guarantee all the other communities that this army will never be used as a military force against the other communities, like that the weapons might be used inwards and not outwards? And I'm going to give you an explicit illustration of that complex. Okay, I'm going to give you an example of what happened, for instance, in Lebanon in 2006. Okay, so the Minister of Defense back then, Elias El-Mor, who's a Greek Orthodox, the Minister of Defense at that time was part of what we call the March 14 coalition. So that's the coalition that, starting 2005, opposed Hezbollah's coalition. Hezbollah was in another coalition called the March 8 coalition. And during the war of summer 2006, Elias El-Mor, Minister of Defense, not only did his best not to engage the army against the Israelis, he ordered several battalions to stay in the barracks, not do anything against the Israelis, even during the land invasion. But during the war, he openly collaborated with the Israelis as they were attacking Lebanon. He asked them officially, it was all over the place in the media. He didn't even do it like, under the table. No. Completely proud of it. He literally asked the Israelis not to target the Christian areas. He told them to bombard the Shia areas until the job is done. And as then we discovered after the war, and that was on that one, he went a little bit more discreet. He even indicated to the Israelis where to hit the Shia areas. And that's your Minister of Defense in times of war. So that is exactly what the communities have in mind when they say, should we really trust 100% completely one single trans-community army to defend us against external threats? We can, yes, okay, we can have that army, but obviously we might need to have a second option hidden somewhere, because you never know. That's basically what you have in the imaginary of most communities in consociational systems. And that explains why most consociational countries rely rather for their protection, whether from the inside or from the outside, they would rather go with militias. Now, in the West, the word militia, the notion of militia is very pejorative, okay? And we tend to see militias as a dysfunction, the manifestation of a serious problem in the political system, or sometimes even a threat to the state. But again, in consociational countries, there is a more or less explicit agreement between the state and the communities that gives sometimes quite a large room for the communities to organize their own protection, militia forces against the external threats. Obviously, we don't want officially those. If the state let it slide when it comes to communities organizing, parallel military organizations, it is at the condition that they will be used only against external threats, not the weapons won't be used inwards. So I'm going to take another example. Take Switzerland, okay? I don't think anyone who's listening to us will say Switzerland is a backwardish country or whatever, okay? It's considered, to be a civilized country, modern, functional, and guess what? In the same time, it is a consociational country. Well, guess what? In Switzerland, we have only 4 to 5% of the armed forces there okay, that are placed under the authority of the central state. That's it. 4 to 5% of the military forces are under the authority of the central state, and 95%, the rest, basically, what is left, 95% of the armed forces in Switzerland are local forces, okay, placed under the local authorities, obviously what we call the canton's authorities. Now, back to the Lebanese case. In the Lebanese case, obviously things are a little bit different. That's not exactly Switzerland, but in the same time, today we have only one militia that is in charge or gave itself the mission of defending the territory against external invaders, external threats. Okay, that's basically the Shia are the only community with that kind of militia. In the same time, the Shia will explain that, yes, it is true that we are the only ones, but at the end of the day, the Shia areas are the most vulnerable ones in the face of the Israeli capacité de nuisance. And another argument that they're going to present is that the IRL, the Islamic resistance, did fight equally between 1982 and 2000 during the occupation, and then again in 2006. But before that, so between 1992 and 2000, basically, the Islamic resistance, yes, a Shia militia, but all the same, they liberated equally Shiite towns and villages, but also Sunni, Durzi, Christian towns and villages. They fought for everybody. They were ready. They put their lives, their combatants, put their lives on the front line. They were ready to die, and some of them did die for the sake of liberating all sorts of villages, like from all different sects. Hassan Nasrallah, by the way, always offered the victories of the IRL to all the Lebanese. He never said it's a Hezbollah, it's a Shia victory, and what about the other communities? When are you going to organize your own defense? No, we didn't have that. Now, a second point that I want to make, because it is important. In consociational systems, what we see usually is that the militias, they do not replace the army. It's not a competition. It's not in either the militia or the army. It's more the way they eventually organize is more of a cohabitation, okay? So sometimes actually they even work in a complementary way, okay? They organize their forces, their duties, and even their spaces for action in a complementary way. I'm going to give you an example. In 2013, 2014, we had the arrival into Lebanon of a certain number of Salafo jihadi groups, who would be fighting in Syria. And they came into Lebanon and they settled in areas, Sunni areas, near the border, whether in the Bekaa, in the north of Lebanon, around Akkar, etc. And they created a kind of a state within the state. Like the army was, like at some point, it was very difficult for the Lebanese state, to function properly there and to have their institutions, their administrations, etc. And Hezbollah and the army, they talked, and everybody was in agreement that the army should do the cleaning job and go after the Salafo jihadis, groups like ISIS, etc., as I said. And the IRL was glad to leave it to the army because as a Shia organization, remember, we are in a consociational system and there are competitions between the communities. So as a Shia organization, Hezbollah didn't want to antagonize their Sunni compatriots. They didn't want to be accused of being like a Shia force trying to kind of punish a Sunni community for accommodating, Sunni groups coming from Syria, something like that. But then, obviously, when Israel attacks, then the IRL takes over and the Lebanese army takes the back seat, because everybody knows that when it comes to Israel, the Lebanese army does not have the means to fight the Israeli army. So at the end of the day, both the IRL and Hezbollah, and especially since the second part of the 80s, they have quite insisted on the fact that they're not questioning the legitimacy of the Lebanese army. That's the thing. They're not at odds. They're not questioning the legitimacy of the Lebanese army. But what the army had has to admit is, as I said, they don't have the means to do properly that job. It is a fact that the Lebanese army has always been, under-equipped, under-trained, under-armed, etc. Now, even more interesting, and this is where we have a huge Western and Israeli paradox, huge Israeli and Western paradox. In the last 20, 30 years, especially 20 years, there have been a number of attempts, coming mainly from the US and from France. Let's put it this way, mainly the US and France. The US and France had tried several times to help the army, the Lebanese army, reach a decent level of professionalism, decent equipment. The point, obviously, was to help Israel by doing so. The idea was to make the IRL irrelevant. Like, if Lebanon has a strong army, what's the point of keeping the IRL? The IRL will lose its legitimacy, etc., etc. Okay, so the idea was to transfer that duty of defending the country to its proper. The proper organization was supposed to do so, which is the Lebanese army. And the idea, obviously, was to hope that eventually Hezbollah and the IRL would, come out of the equation. So, both France and the US, they spend money, time, energy on, preparing training programs. Some serious budgets were promised to help the army to buy proper weapons. And talking about the paradox, the sarcastic aspect of all of it is that the very country that keeps complaining about Hezbollah and keeps asking the international community to do its best to get rid, not just Lebanon, the Middle East of Hezbollah, and obviously I'm talking about Israel, that same country, Israel, systematically aborted all the programs of any kind of help to the Lebanese army, all the attempts at transforming the Lebanese army into a real proper army. Israel does not want to have a real proper army existing in Lebanon. Now, the argument that is pushed forward by the Israelis, because the Israelis do explain every sabotage, every boycott, you have no idea the number of times where the American administration said, we're budgeting so many millions for the Lebanese army. And then the very last minute, no, we're not sending the money because Israel said we shouldn't. The argument that is pushed forward by the Israelis is that if we are to give proper, decent equipment, meaning proper weapons, proper rockets, proper everything to the Lebanese army, then the Lebanese army is going to pass on that military equipment to Hezbollah. Which, if you think of it 2 seconds, is an utmost ridiculous argument, because whatever the Lebanese army is going to get, they will never give them, America, France will never give them like the best of the best, the state of the art kind of weapons. But whatever kind of military equipment they could give to the Lebanese army, weapon-wise, the IRL has way better anyways. So it's just, I think the Israelis do not want to, they don't want to have like a Lebanon that would be capable of defending itself, whether, the IRL, through the IRL or through the Lebanese army. And
it also makes it always like a welcome narrative that when they actually start to fight Lebanon, it's always fighting this terror group. It's not really fighting Lebanon. I mean, they have this narrative now that they are freeing Lebanon from Hezbollah's grasp.
Yeah, but at the same time,
if they are fighting the Lebanese army themselves, that narrative is gone, and also they are considering the legal aspects regarding humanitarian law and international law.
That was very true until this war.
Yeah, that changed it now.
Because
exactly.
in this war, they're absolutely bombarding everything and
unhinged.
Everybody.
Yes.
They're bombarding even their friends. They're bombarding all the communities. They're even bombarding Roman antique sites. They're destroying culture, history. I mean, I don't know. I never heard about the Romans being the ancestors of Hezbollah, but whatever. Now, on this topic, maybe there's also something we might need to address, which is, you talked about whether what the IRL was doing was legal, the notion of legality. because obviously we have a lot of Lebanese who, are anti-Hezbollah. They would like to have more, stronger state institutions, a stronger state, etc. And one argument is the weapons of Hezbollah, or what Hezbollah does, is illegal because it's not validated by the Lebanese government. This one is even more complex, I would say, question. It's tricky because, as paradoxical as it may sound, and we're talking legality, okay? We're talking text, etc., and we're talking constitutional mechanisms and stuff like that. We're not talking morals, okay? We're really talking like what fits the rule or not. Paradoxically, the IRL's action is legal, and it is validated by the state, but not in so many words, not explicitly. Here's the thing. Since 2005, so since the end of the Syrian tutelage over Lebanon and the return of the decision-making process in politics to the Lebanese, so since 2005, all the governments we had in Lebanon did indirectly legalize the resistance action, not necessarily gladly. I can tell you that every time we had like some serious discussion, and some of them were quite heated. And in the same time, they agreed on and what they side upon is vague enough to, it leaves room for Hezbollah to act the way it pleases, but at the same time, it could also be interpreted quite differently and against Hezbollah. Let's put it this way, because I'm maybe not very clear. Just like in so many countries, every new government in Lebanon has to present what we call, in Arabic, translated in French, it's déclaration ministérielle. In French, we call them déclaration de politique générale. So it's a kind of, every government has a roadmap, right? The worksheet of what they intend to do while being in power, and they submit it to the parliament to get, the confidence or the trust vote, the go, basically, to start working. It's like that, and obviously most democracies. Now, it turns out that since 2005, in any ministerial declaration that is, as I said, agreed upon all the parties and all the communities, otherwise it's not legal. Remember, the Constitution says any decision by the government has to be okay by all the communities, or at least the main communities, otherwise it's invalid. So whether pro or anti-Hezbollah they were, all the parties in Lebanon, they all signed that ministerial declaration, and in every ministerial declaration you have a little paragraph. And that paragraph says this in substance: all the Lebanese have the right to defend themselves against the Israeli threat by all means that they can find at their disposal, roughly. By all the necessary means, by all the appropriate means. So it's a vague formula, right? It's basically the government saying, I'm just saying that the Lebanese have the right to self-defense. But they're saying all the Lebanese, meaning as members, as individuals. And they're saying, obviously, they're talking about the Israeli threat. They're not talking necessarily only in case of invasion, only in case of occupation. No, Israeli threat. And obviously with Israeli, basically violating the Lebanese sovereignty every day and on so many forms, basically that means all the time. Or that can be interpreted as all the time. When you say Israeli threat, it's different than saying Israeli occupation, Israeli invasion, because that means only in certain circumstances. So when you say that all the Lebanese have the right to self-defense, every time Israel basically is hurting them, harming them, and by all the means they can find, basically what the heck are you saying? You are opening the door, or you are saying, amongst other things, that what Hezbollah does is okay, and what the IRL does okay. That does not mean, again, that the government is happy, okay? That does not mean that they don't wish it to be otherwise. It's just that they cannot make illegal initiatives taken by Lebanese in self-defense against Israeli attacks. See what I mean? So indirectly, all the governments, by allowing all the Lebanese to defend themselves the best they can, because at the end of the day, the army cannot do it once again. So the government admits it. But that's also what they say, technically, while not using the words, while not saying the state cannot do it, the army cannot do it. So at the end of the day, defending yourselves, the Lebanese, as individuals, as citizens, the duty or the right to defend yourself is going to be your job. You're going to have to do it by yourself. That means that they cannot allow themselves to call illegal, to categorize as illegal anything any Lebanese would do to protect themselves against Israel. That goes for Hezbollah too. See what I mean? So it's a shady thing, but definitely here we have a kind of a door open for Hezbollah to say what the Israel does is legal.
Yeah, it's even more than a loophole. It's like implicit affirmation of, at least, yeah.
But there was some talk about what about we don't say that, okay? And the problem is, because the question was, okay, where does the government stand as far as, the Israeli threats? And obviously, again, if you don't want to say that, then you're going to have to say, the only other option, the only replacement is the army is the one and only in charge, administration in charge of defending the territory. But guess what? They can't. So the other situation, it's like two impossible options. It's what we call in French un choix cornélien. It's like both options basically are ridden with C4 and nitroglycerin. Both of them are complicated. And I'm not sure about the solution to that, but the solution, if the Lebanese army cannot be a true thing sometime soon, and obviously Israel is going to do and continue to do their best for the Lebanese army not to be a thing, and if the Lebanese continue to be attacked by the Israelis, and that's definitely going to continue, then we're going to have to go, with the Lebanon, and then we'll have no choice but to have to live with the IRL. And if they don't want the IRL to be there anymore, then the only solution is for Israel to stop attacking Lebanon, stop violating its sovereignty again and again and over again. The Lebanese cannot do it. The Lebanese government cannot do it. The IRL, as I said, okay, if we, keep it out of the equation, then that's the role of the international community. And the question is, what is the international community ready to do to prevent Israel from harming Lebanon over and over and over again? It's like the snake, biting its tails.
Yeah.
Then going all over again.
Yeah, it looks like they are not willing to do much about this. But yeah, let's see how that develops. Okay. Aurélie, great. This was a very, very good episode to put into context the relation of Hezbollah with the Lebanese state. Also, a lot of misconceptions regarding this topic. Not least because of actually propaganda by the Israelis and the West themselves. So now we have a better view on that. There is another topic that we still have to tackle in the next episode. We have at least one more planned, and that is about Hezbollah and its international relations.
Yep.
And let's leave it at that for now. Okay, cool. So thanks to everybody for listening and commenting and give us your questions, your contradictions, your different opinions. We will try to address them if possible. If necessary, we will make another episode to address them. So feel free to comment under this.
Can I just add a PS? I was thinking about Ilyas Al-Mur, the Minister of Defense of 2006. Yes. Eventually, when he left the government, he was recruited to be head of the Interpol Foundation.
Interesting.
I'm not going to comment further.
No.
But that's just something I remember. So.
funny how the world works, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks again, Aurélie. See you soon.
Welcome. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. See you. Bye. Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht, das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultra-geheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.